began to think about what it is to be a part of the Napa Valley Vintners Association, which is an amazing trade organization. And essentially the core mission of the Vintners is to promote and safeguard the appellation that is Napa Valley. And so with that, I thought, what better topic to be able to have maybe a roundtable discussion about what the AVAs mean here, how they came about, what's the core rationale, what are the challenges that the AVAs face, how were they formed, and kind of a look at politics and terroir and history and so forth. And each one of the panelists today is going to have a little different perspective on that. We also have some panelists here, Benoit, who is from France, and hopefully will give us a little perspective of old world to new world, and how appellations have been utilized in the old world, and where we have kind of taken that and run with it. So with that said, I'm going to turn the presentation back over to Jeff, and thank you very much for coming.
And we have a few more thank yous, and then we're going to get going here. But thank you, Jeff, for conceiving of this event and hosting it in your beautiful winery caves. Really, really great to be here. Here's the way it's going to work. Everybody gets to talk a bit, and then we're going to taste these wines, which were made by all of us in front of you, and discuss them with the winemakers for a bit. So Jeff asked me very quickly to talk about two perspectives, just to get things going. Kind of a wine writer's vision of appellation, and a winemaker's vision of appellation. And I just want to leave you with a couple simple thoughts to think about before Tim gives us some actual facts. But what I noticed as a wine writer was that I would taste lots of wines, and I would really get a broad-based view of what wines from various regions tasted like. I mean, you have a real bird's eye view because you are tasting everything. And so you see trends, tendencies, and so you think you actually know what appellation means. Then, as a winemaker, you get on the ground and you realize that you're working in a vineyard. You might be taking two parcels from a vineyard. One is on the crest of a hill and the other is a little bit on the slope. Both Cabernet, both completely different, okay? They ripen like weeks apart, not days apart, weeks apart. They ferment in different ways, and you find this everywhere you go. I mean, I make wines from Calistoga down to Oakville, up on Mount Veeder, Pope Valley, even in Sonoma, and I'm always surprised at how little I know about really what's going to happen every year. I mean, it's very complicated. So it's great to have a bird's eye view, but it's important to remember that every year is different, and every little parcel in every appellation is different, and it's really a lot more complicated than you would think. With that said, I'm going to leave it to Tim to talk to us about it.
Well, it is a very complicated topic, that's for sure. But thank you, Jeff. Thank you, Jeff Smith, for inviting us here. What a beautiful cellar to talk about a very, very important topic. And as wine lovers here, I think all of us appreciate that wine is of the earth. It is of the elements. It's of man. And what could be more important than how you call it? Its origin is everything, in my view. And historically, people used to put much more emphasis on what man does. I think as we evolve as a wine region, we put much more emphasis on what the land does, what the potential of that is. So the appellations are exceedingly important. I have come to a firm conviction of that as being involved with wine at Robert Mondavi since '74, having full-time and having worked every summer there since it was begun, and a family that's, as a kid, throwing grapes up in the air during harvest, seeing grapes come in from Woodin Valley and Gordon Valley, Childs Valley, all these areas. So all of this, historically, before the 1981 appellation of Napa Valley was formalized, the wines of America were called after their political boundaries. Napa County, well, it was never Napa County, that's the issue. It was Sonoma County, California, it was usually county-based. Napa Valley was unusual in that regard. The wines of Napa Valley always were recognized as Napa Valley. It was never Napa County for some reason. If you look at the buses, Napa Valley. If you look at the phone book, it's Napa Valley. It was never Napa County. So in 1978, when BATF said that any use of an appellation needed to be defined according to the use of name or name recognition, being able to have historical significance, be able to speak to climate and soil distinctiveness, that's you have to, and it has to be found on a USGS map. So, okay, everybody said, fine, what do we do? I happened to be on the board of the Vintners at the time and was a member of the Appellation Committee. And we put our heads together, and the Vintners came up with a concept. And that concept was that the Napa Valley ought to be identified. They looked in the definition, and it said a valley. A valley is a watershed that is drained by a river. And so, well, of course, then the Napa Valley ought to be the watershed, meaning the Miacamas Range, which is the watershed between Napa County and Sonoma County, and the Vaca Range, and everything that drains into the Napa River ought to be called Napa Valley. Well, if you look a little closer, you say, well, gosh, that isn't historically how things really developed. The watershed does not include Pope Valley, parts of Childs Valley, much of Capel Valley. Much of the outlying valleys were not part of that, yet they contributed to the fame of Napa Valley. The fame is not just something that came yesterday. Grapes began to be grown in the 1850s. I grew up at Charles Krug. It was the 1861 was the date of that foundation of that winery. So there's a long history, yes, truncated. Modern history is something that is we are all a part of now. But so I said, I don't really think we ought to be doing that. The Vintner's response was, well, we don't know what the ATF is going to do. There's another application at that time that said Napa Valley was just the floor of the valley, excluding Sterling, excluding the hillsides. And obviously that was not going to work either. But we said, I think what we ought to do is look at the history of it and include all of the areas that historically contributed to the creation of the fame of Napa Valley, include those areas, and exclude all the areas that had never had grapes planted to them. In effect, to have Napa Valley be recognized as an overarching area that would be inclusive, just as Bordeaux is, just as Burgundy is, just as other effective appellations. So, long story short, that is what the second appellation in America came to be. The first in California. In 1981, Napa Valley was established, as I had mentioned, which was based on historical significance, to not disenfranchise people that brought us to the party. The second phase was that this began a land rush, a mentality of all I need to really be recognized is an appellation in the mindset of all of us in the valley. We had to rush to have a vineyard designate. We had to rush to have an appellation. And in that rush, there were many appellations that were established, some better, some worse. But appellations tend to, in their formative period, expand and expand and expand. And ATF is alcohol, tobacco, and firearms. They don't know what they're talking about. They don't know wine. And so we had to educate people as to what was going on. And then we found that, in truth, the appellations did have a tendency to become larger than they should. So how do we deal with that? So as things evolved, we developed, there was a Vintner event in February of '88, and there were a number of proposals as to what we should make for Napa Valley. The proposal that we put forth was that there be the outline valley, a separation between, well, maybe you can use this, because this is the map that we used during the development of this time. Initially, USGS map of Napa County. Then, all of a sudden, we developed this map was let's put this one over. This map was created in '92, even though the concept came in '88. But the concept was that we would separate the Miacamas Range to the west, Silverado Range to the east, and have the 6 townships of Calistoga, St. Helena, Rutherford, Oakville, Yountville, and Napa. That there would have to be an overarching concept that would respect the differences. The parent material of the hills would be separated from the alluvial fans of the valley floor itself. So the Miacamas Range, as well as the Silverado Range, have parent material, and then the alluvial fans make up the valley. So therefore, that cut. And then the weather patterns basically go north-south. The bay is much more consistent in temperature. Calistoga is much more varied, colder and hotter, more rainfall. So we said that there should be some bisections up and down the valley. What better way of identifying them than the townships? The purpose of the appellation is to align the consumer, the grower, the vintner in something that is understandable and legitimate and relative to the character potential of wine. American systems are different from Bordeaux or Burgundy in that that's all they do, a statement of origin. It is not a statement of quality, it's a statement of character potential. So effectively, we put this forward. Oakville and Rutherford were the first 2 appellations in the valley floor to have been established in, I think it was 93. But the basis of this, and I'll try to stop now, is to have been able to give Napa Valley an overview that was legitimate, topographically, geographically, climate-wise, and our valley is unique. If you look to the appellations of Italy, it's very difficult because the geography is very different. Burgundy is a little bit easier. Perhaps the way Bordeaux has identified is something that the other thing we wanted to do was start with fewer but larger appellations and not have it be too precise. Not go down to the vineyard designate of which is what Burgundy does, but to have it be more like Bordeaux in the sense that it would strictly identify the townships. And so that's what we have, and that's pretty much what has followed since that time. And with that, maybe I should sit down.
Thank you very much, Tim. Before I dive into my piece of the presentation, I just wanted to acknowledge that I had the great opportunity, like many of us here in Napa Valley, of working at Robert Mondavi in 1987, 88, and 89. And I had a very low-level job there, but that's where I discovered my passion for wine. And it was Tim and your father who really set that spark off in me, and we're sitting here today largely because of that opportunity that I had there. So I wanted to say thank you very much for that, Tim. Beth, Milliken, and I worked on the early formations of Appellation St. Helena. Now, the actual lines of the sub-appellation had already been drawn. And by the way, there are 16 sub-appellations now in Napa, plus the master appellation, which is Napa Valley. So 17 in total for Napa Valley. And I'm going to talk specifically about Napa because that's where I grew up, and that's really what I know. There are some other speakers here who will speak about other different regions in California. But Beth and I had this notion along the way, as did a few others, that maybe we needed to actually organize a group around the formation of the boundary lines that had already been drawn and begin to try to do something with that. And so very early on, I remember having a discussion with Bob Steinauer, who was running the vineyard operations for Beringer at the time. And he said, Jeff, I want to tell you this story about how the St. Helena borders were developed. It was Bob Steinauer, Chuck Carpy, Alex Ryan, a couple other kind of forward-thinking guys that were trying to establish the boundaries of St. Helena. And St. Helena was a little late to the game. There were others that had been organized a little earlier, one of which was Rutherford, which is just south of St. Helena. And so as the TTB or the BATF at the time documents were being presented to establish the lines of where the Rutherford appellation were going to be, This was largely driven by Andy Beckstoffer and a crew of other landowners in Rutherford. And so they had established or proposed that the northernmost border of the sub-appellation of Rutherford should be Sulphur Creek. Now, for those of you who know Sulphur Creek, that bisects the town of St. Helena. So Bob and Chuck Carpy were very alarmed by this, and so they called Andy Beckstoffer and they said, "Andy, we really need to have a meeting about this. We've got to talk our way through this border issue." And so Andy agreed to meet with them, and Chuck very wisely suggested to Andy that maybe Bob and Chuck would drive all the way down to Rutherford, and they could have lunch at Taylor's and discuss the border. Now, of course, Taylor's is on the south side of Sulphur Creek in the center of St. Helena. And the irony of that was not lost on Andy Beckstoffer. So there was a powwow, and they were able to renegotiate where that line would be, which became Zinfandel. Yeah, you know more than I do about how. So, it's a very interesting trend line to take a look at. So, what is it that actually constitutes an AVA? And so, clearly, politics were a driving element to this, and I found that to be a very fun little anecdote and certainly a very interesting thing. I can't imagine. If the Rutherford appellation actually did bisect St. Helena. I think that would be kind of a crazy thing, but potentially could have happened. So my dad he moved the family here in the early 60s. He was a real estate guy, and he always said to me, "Jeff, location, location, location." And he just got that in the back of my mind. And so as I began to become more involved in the wine industry, this concept of location became to resonate with me, and that's one of the reasons why I got excited to talk to Beth and get a group together that would be able to demonstrate what St. Helena meant. Of course, we had a vested interest with the Hourglass Vineyard being right in the heart of the St. Helena appellation, and so it was with that vested interest that we began to move forward and so forth. And so I will say this, that at that time, I had a rather idealized vision of what appellation meant to me. I wasn't terribly interested in the politics or the history or some of the cultural aspects that went into driving the AVAs. I was looking at it more from trying to draw the straight line from the place, the sense of place, to what you tasted in the bottle. And so it was with that mindset that we got Appellation St. Helena up and going, and one of my main charges was to try to come up for the rationale that set St. Helena apart from the other sub-AVAs. And I spent probably 2 years working on this project, and I studied a tremendous amount. There was a lot of work that was done by the Napa Valley Vintners Association in defining soils, climate, aspects, geography, all of the things that you would think would wind into telling the story of that place and how that related back to a flavor profile or a characteristic, aroma, whatever it is, relative to what you taste in the bottle. And the first thing that got my attention was when I looked at a soil profile map of Napa Valley. And I actually have one here. If anybody's interested in seeing it, I'd be happy to pass it around. But it was mind-bogglingly complex. And it looks like a Rorschach test. It's just colors everywhere, representing a massive amount of different soil profiles with absolutely no organization to them whatsoever. And I looked at that and I went, whoa, that's really intense. What I found out very quickly after that is that we have half of the world's soil orders here in Napa Valley, a minimum of 150 different variants of 33 major soil series. Each one of the sub-appellations themselves had not less than 21 major soil series, and again, no rhyme or reason to them. Here we are at the Blue Line Estate. We probably have 6 soil profiles here on one vineyard site that's 20 acres. So from a soil standpoint, I said to myself, wow, this is an immensely complex place. And the reason for that is that we essentially sit at the convergent edge of three tectonic plates that have formed the Pacific West Coast. All of the mountain ranges and so forth, and all of the soil profiles on the West Coast have been formed by the mashing together of three tectonic plates. It's the only place in the world that I can see in studying tectonic plate maps where you actually have that convergent point. So those three plates come together right off the Golden Gate Bridge out near the Farallon Islands. And they have moved 450 miles north in the last 7 million years, which is actually quite a short period of time in geologic trackings. And they continue to move north. That's why we have earthquakes in California. But it is those the activity of those three tectonic plates that has created just a massive array of soil profiles. I don't claim to be an expert on Bordeaux, and I may be corrected by some of the other panelists who have worked there and know it much better than I do. But in the readings that I've been able to come up with, just to give you some comparative analysis, because the concept of appellation, I think, as I saw it at that point in this idealized state, was a borrowed paradigm from the old world. So I was kind of borrowing that nomenclature and applying it here. So it would be obvious for me to take a look at Bordeaux as a counterpoint. So from what I've been able to determine in Bordeaux, there are 6, maybe 8 soil profiles. And Benoit, would you say that that's at least in the ballpark?
Medoc being kind of the size of Napa Valley, if you look at it, they separate the estate and the appellation, and there's 6 terraces that have been really known to influence the quality of the wine. And that overlapping of soil profile and climatology will give them to build sub-appellation and then to classify the wine. So I would agree.
Those 6 types are all part of one series.
Yeah, 6 types are part of one soil series. Yeah, 4 official soil series there. So it gives you a quick read on the complexity of soil series. And if you're a believer in terroir, I think that you have to take some of these points very seriously as you're trying to create this straight line between sense of place and flavor profiles and so forth. So immediately I was faced with a challenge that was a little overwhelming. Then you start taking a look at some of the other terroir elements that will influence grape growing and winemaking, and we have some amazing winemakers who I think are going to speak a little bit to this a little bit later. And that is the next piece of the puzzle that's very important is climate. And so if you break down the 5 world's grape farming climate zones in Napa Valley, you have at least 4 of those. And they, as Tim had mentioned, are segmented in a north to south orientation, but you have an amazing array of different microclimates within a 30-mile arc that is Napa Valley. On top of that, you have a diurnal temperature swing here because of our proximity to the Pacific Ocean and the fog influences and so forth. You have a breathing effect of fog coming in and then receding and coming in and receding throughout the growing cycle. And you may have a diurnal temperature swing within 12 hours of 50 degrees. It could be 100 degrees in the afternoon. By 2, 3 a.m., it could be 50 degrees. This is a very unique engine that has a profound influence on grape ripening. And it's something that is pretty unique in the world of wine growing. And then you can kind of keep peeling the layers back on this, and each time you peel another layer back, you realize that there's another layer of complexity to add on top of that. Let's talk about aspect for a second and how that relates to geography. You have the Vaca mountain range on the east and the Mayacamas mountain range on the west. Those mountain ranges go from 0 to 2,000 feet almost instantaneously. So in Bordeaux, from the banks of the Gironde River into the Medoc, which is about 14 miles away, you have a 130-foot rise. A very, very gentle, slow rise. Here, you have this immediate upward of 2 mountain ranges, and every possible nook and cranny and crag that you can imagine as these mountains push up. So the aspects and the orientation to sun are incredibly varied here. So you start winding all of this stuff together, and you realize, at least I came to the conclusion that this is probably, and this is also true of other grape growing regions throughout Northern California, but specifically to Napa Valley, I really felt this is probably the most complex grape growing region in the world. And because of that, and because of the fact that I had borrowed a paradigm of thought process trying to create this nice, logical, straight line from sense of place to what you taste in the glass, I realized in a hurry that I was going to have to reorient my perspective on that straight line was not going to be a straight line, that it was going to be significantly more complex than I had anticipated it would be. And it does throw into question the challenges of some of the sub-AVAs relative to this idea of can you taste the place. And I have subsequently begun to think that it's much more, in order to actually identify the characteristics of place, you really have to get a lot more micro in your thought process. And you really have to drill down to the site specificity of a vineyard and what is going on in that specific vineyard, which makes it harder for a consumer to grasp onto the concept of appellation. And I still believe that there is a lot of validity to the appellation process. I think Napa Valley as an appellation works pretty well for me. When we start breaking it down into the sub-appellations, especially when some of these lines were drawn a little bit more over political lines than they were necessarily over raw terroir lines, then it gets a little bit more complex. And you could probably also make the same argument for the borrowed paradigm of vintage. If vintage is something that overlays, it's a yearly overlay of climate over a region, you begin to start seeing some real challenges and complexities of making blanket statements over a place that is as complex as Northern California. So with that, I'd like to again thank you for coming, and I'll pass the baton over to Dave Ramey.
Thanks, Jeff. I think you can see me better if I stand up, or perhaps hear me. I'm sort of the Auslander here. Our winery is based in Healdsburg, and in fact, although I worked in Napa Valley for a total of 6 years, I've made Cabernet continuously from the Napa Valley, from all different areas, all different appellations, since 1996. So that's, what is that? I can't even do the math. 15 years? 16? I can't. 17? And we make Chardonnay mostly from Sonoma County, although there's a little Carneros, Napa Carneros. But all of our Cabernet comes from the Napa Valley. Now, why is that? And while Jeff focused on soil a little bit, I'm going to give a broader picture of climate. And really, when I go back to the early 80s, I was at CME, and not only had Zelma worked at Mondavi, so we had a connection there, but we shared ownership with Domaine Chandon, so we were getting grapes from Oak Knoll in 1981 and 82. So in those days, Napa Valley was planted to all different kinds of varieties. There was Pinot Noir in Rutherford. There was Riesling. There was a lot of Chenin Blanc, family history there. And it's on its way almost to becoming a monoculture, and I'm not sure that that's a bad thing. But I guess my point is, why is that? So I'm interested in what makes wine taste the way that it does. And you start from a French perspective with knowing or analyzing or finding out if a variety is an early ripener or a late ripener. Okay, so Chardonnay and Pinot Noir, these are early maturers, early ripeners. And if you plant it in Rutherford, you're going to pick it on August 15, and it's not going to develop as well as if it were in a cooler climate. Now, Cabernet Sauvignon, on the other hand, is a late ripener, It needs the heat to ripen. And that's what makes Napa Valley so successful with Cabernet Sauvignon. Now, why is it? It's because one of only a few places in the world, not only do we have this tectonic plate merging together, but we have what's called an ocean upwelling off our coast, same thing off the Chilean coast, and it creates this fog. So we can see our weather for when in the morning, or, used to be Sonoma County Airport had a United flight that connected. It left at 6:30 and connected to SFO. And I'd get on that in the summertime and fly up. And as soon as we get above the fog, you could see the fog just flowing in wherever there was a gap in the hills. And then all the mountaintops sticking out like islands in the ocean above the fog. So that's visible airflow. We can literally see where our air cooling influence is coming from. And that's why we have this 30, 40 degree diurnal swing in the valley floors, not at 2,000 feet. It's not the same up there. So because of that coastal influence, Sonoma County is closer to the ocean, and it's cooler. It's in the days that I worked in Oakville and lived in Glen Ellen, typically 9 or 10 degrees cooler in Sonoma than in Napa. Now, there's good Cabernet in Sonoma, but and there's a lot of conversation in recent years about alcohol levels. If cool climate Cabernet was such a hot item, 13.5% alcohol Cabernet, then Russian River would be famous for Cabernet Sauvignon. But that's not the case. And really, I think I've made my point.
I will share with you my impression from a French perspective arriving in Napa in 2004. Studying Bordeaux and training in Bordeaux and working in Bordeaux, things were obviously they're like very rigid and everything is established. It's been a long time. I mean, you're looking like of centuries of work have been done over there. So 54 appellation in Bordeaux, known from the 15th centuries. Just talking about Medoc, to have something at the scale of Napa, people were knowing pretty soon in the game, like what was the good wineries, the good sites. Classification came in 1855, and people established already what was the first grow, and they did that range. Coming here in Napa for me was kind of the Far West. It was like everything is young, it's dynamic, it's moving, and to hear you, team, explain the stories and how things change, you're looking at a very short scale. You're talking about 1980s, 70s. It's just baby step, and I think hearing what you said, Jeff, it's fantastic to feel like we just. I think for me, it's the first zoom in that we're doing right now, and we're gonna go drilling and get to know Napa better than what we know now. I've been back in France last December and get fortunate to meet a geologist named Pierre Bechler, and we were talking about the formation of Bordeaux. And that was striking because I thought it was pretty easy. As you say, it seems on paper it's fairly easy, but realistically it's not really easy. I mean, you have variation you're talking about 10 meters range that make a huge impact on the wine, on the grapes growing. And so here we're talking about 2,000 elevation. So being lucky to have been the site of Continuum, for example, it's fantastic. It should be an appellation on its own, but how big should be that appellation? What's the variation? You're talking about soil climatology. There is many things that play. Working with Rian, we have 6 different sites going from Coombsville to Calistoga. Being inside an appellation, how many differences we have there? I think we're just touching the surface right here. And I think it's going to be very interesting for the Napa palate. Like, I remember first grew up in Lyon and drinking some Saint-Emilion with my dad. What does it mean? So then you have the Grand Cru, you have the Cru Classé, and same thing for the Médoc. And I think that's where we might go. I don't know if it's going to be a mix of Burgundy, mid Bordeaux, but I think for the people and for us to know what we're working with, get to know the valley more, work on the soil, work on the climatology, on every aspect that you mentioned. Everything is fascinating. And that's going to be about 30, 40, 50, 60, 100 years of work and development, and it's going to require passionate people to put Napa on the map. And I think for me the big thing is to be really excited to be part of that and to be able to share that with you guys. It's fantastic. Because when you look at Bordeaux, obviously it's been done before me, and there's nothing else that will change really soon, I think. So.
A very minor Egyptian pharaoh, Tutankhamun, was buried with 34 amphora, and each one of those amphora has a mark on it, and the mark tells the name of the vintner. It tells the year in the birth of, or the year in the reign of Tutankhamun when the wine was made. And it also tells 2 details of where the grapes were grown. So I don't think that France invented anything in terms of appellations. Appellations have been important to people since the dawn of time. It's what gives value to the product that's produced there. And I think the French have taken it to a very high level. If you look at the 4th definition in the Larousse Dictionary of terroir, it talks about the spirit of the people and the things that happened on that property that produced those agricultural products. So it's been given great value. My first experiences with Napa Valley and the ideas of different sites producing different things was, as Jeff's was, with Mondavi and working with Tim. I was given a job as an undergraduate. Was given a hat and sunscreen and a Jeep and was told to go out to these different areas and pick grapes and bring them back and do analysis on them and then leave that analysis on everybody's message machines at the winery. And I discovered very quickly that when I tasted those grapes, besides keeping me regular, they were extremely different. Even within a very, very small site, they were incredibly, incredibly different. And that was my first real foray into seeing what the idea of, not just the idea of sub-AVAs, but the idea of tiny, what the Burgundians call climat, which are the just vineyard designate sites, and how important those are. I got to work on an AVA that failed, which was amusing. I was part of the Touquette AVA that became Coombsville, just because the name wasn't liked by so many people. But one of the interesting things that I ran into in writing up the Touquette AVA was that in talking to the TTB, we had this small section of land between the Carneros AVA and the Touquette AVA that was not in either of those AVAs. And it was the parking lot for Home Depot in Napa. And I was told in no uncertain terms that if I didn't include the parking lot for Home Depot, that the AVA wouldn't go through. So we had to expand the lines on the AVA to include the Home Depot parking lot. So now you'll be happy to know that if you plant grapes in the Home Depot parking lot, that will be included in the Coombsville AVA. I think clearly AVAs are very political, and I think that what we need to take home from that is that we've established what the Burgundians call the village. We've taken these great AVAs, we've established this idea of the village, and now it's time to pare those down and look at where the climat are. And like Charles de Gaulle said about governing France, it's impossible to do that in a country that produces 380 different cheeses with 33 different soil series in one place. I think it's going to be very difficult. And then you add on to that the difference of the climate in those areas, and the terroir in Napa Valley is confounding to the nth degree, much more confounding than anything I saw in Saint-Emilion. One of the things that I was asked to address, also how technology in winemaking has affected how we make wines from different AVAs. And I thought about this a great deal. I worked in Saint-Emilion when Saint-Emilion was undergoing an incredible technological advancement, and it was probably the real focus of the wine world in the 90s. There were so many different things happening there in terms of concentrators and microbubbling and all of these marvelous things that you hear so much about that not many people use, hopefully. And I remembered back to an experience that I had with one of the great terroirists of our world, Kees van Leeuwen, who was the vineyard manager for Cheval Blanc for a long time and a great professor, and the guy who did the map on terroir in Saint-Emilion. And we were standing over a hole in the middle of the Cheval Blanc vineyard as we watched water from the water table bubble into it. And we were talking about technology in winemaking and how that was obliterating the idea of terroir in Saint-Emilion. And Kees said, there's no way that a concentrator machine is going to obliterate the character of this wine. If you concentrate wine, you're just going to concentrate the good stuff with the bad stuff. So you're going to get that terroir character anyway. It's just going to be more intense, good and bad. So I think it's very, very difficult, and hopefully that will deter winemakers from trying to overdo wines. And hopefully we will continue to try to get the most of what our terroirs offer us without trying to cover them up with our ridiculous winemaking ideas.
Okay, a lot has already been said, and I appreciate all the comments that have been made. I was just asked really to speak about obviously our estate Cabernet has come from the St. Helena appellation we've been making it for 30 years now. So 1982 was our first vintage. But even when we moved here in 1972, I mean, our vineyard also was Green Hungarian and French Colombard and Napa Gamay and Petit Syrah and field blends. I mean, it was old stuff, and it was all going to what was then the co-op, which was controlled by Gallo, and everything was $200 or $300 a ton, and it was based on sugar and tonnage, and there was a lot of superfine sugar sold in the Napa Valley in those days. I'm sure my father never used it, but I'm sure he did not do that. But anyway, it was a very different thing. As to appellation, yeah, Jeff and I worked a lot on this, and I remember Jeff really the idea of taking that what the appellation is to a flavor in the glass or in the bottle just was virtually impossible because of how different every location is. So I mean, we're on the alluvial soils on the west side of St. Helena. And that's extremely different from where Hourglass is and our exposure and how long the sun stays with us. It's very different from Grace Family, very different from anything on the east side. It's so different that to really try to draw that line is almost impossible, really. What we've done at Spottswoode is that we do use the word, I mean, our label does say St. Helena, Napa Valley. So we note the sub-AVA on our label. But we don't. I mean, I went through our website just before I got here to kind of look at it, and we really do not speak to the appellation per se as much. We do speak to we are located on the west side of St. Helena at the base of the Mayacamas range, and we do speak to that sort of thing. But we don't specifically say, as part of the St. Helena appellation, Spottswoode, blah blah blah, that type of a thing. We don't use it in that regard. So we're very happy with our St. Helena location. We are literally on the west side of the town of St. Helena, 40 acres, 45 acres, right up against the western hills. So it's all old alluvial soils. But what I have found is that for us, and I think another thing, Jeff and I were trying to achieve when we were doing this with others on appellation was, well, Rutherford is so well, like what Rutherford people talk about Rutherford dust. Now, whether that's real or not, every wine that's made in Rutherford there's not a Rutherford dust component. I mean, presumably, right? But people speak of that. Oakville has a great name just because there's sort of a cluster of great wineries there that people know about, and they have a big tasting, and people love to go, and so there's been a lot of excitement about it. And St. Helena, just frankly, at this point, nor has Calistoga, nor have others, haven't garnered that same level of kind of respect or that hierarchy. So for me, it goes back to with what everybody's saying here is it's about what we always talk about for Spottswoode is that it is a wine of a place, and that place is our vineyard. And our goal every year is to make a wine that honors that piece of ground. So we've always worked hard to make sure that we are making what that ground really wishes to give to us, and we are careful to make sure that we make our goal always is to make sure that we make a well-balanced, well-structured wine that has beauty and elegance and will stand the test of time. So we've always tried to keep in balance too anything to do, because obviously aside from appellation and terroir and everything is when you choose to pick your fruit. Are you going to leave it hanging out there for a great deal of time till November? That was a little joke. Or are you going to pick it, when it's ripe and ready to go? I mean, there's a lot of things. There's so much that goes on. And you can tell we know each other reasonably well. Our children are in the same school, so we tend to bump into each other. But, it really is, there's so much that goes into play. But really, as far as appellation goes, there is, how can you say, my sort of disconnect was, well, first of all, of course, Andy Beckstoffer wanting to make it up at the creek, which is laughable. But how do you say that, gosh, was it just that when people laid out Zinfandel Lane that they somehow knew that was the boundary between St. Helena and Rutherford? Of course not. But all the lines are on roads. Those just happen to be the markers or the delineators. It's not the soil. It's not the ground. So I don't want to say that the sub-appellations have no validity, but I do agree with the village that you were talking about. It's really more about talking about, I guess, where you are from. But for Spottswoode, for us, again, we're about wine of a place, and we are much more about Napa Valley than we are about sort of, we're St. Helena, Napa Valley, right? That's just the way that we've always done it, and I don't necessarily see that changing. I just think it will always be talking about our own thing, but being part of something greater, we definitely support all of the efforts to help out and to make more recognition, if it's not just for St. Helena, mostly Napa Valley, and making sure we represent that appellation well. So that's it from the St. Helena side.
Thank you, Beth.
Spottswoode side, excuse me.
Thank you very much, Beth. And really, thank you, all of you panelists, for your expertise and your experience and your comments. Now we're going to actually taste some wine. And I just want to run down what's in the lineup here. So take a look at the wines in front of you. Go taste through the wines as you're doing now for about 5 more minutes. Take your little notes, and then we'll just have each winemaker talk about the wine in the orders that they're presented here. And then if you have any questions about the winemaking, the wines, or anything else that was said today, we'll have a little time for Q&A. And has everybody pretty much gone through the wines? We're going to start anyway. Okay. So, Dave, you want to talk to us a little bit about this wine?
Well, I think I did a little bit. The only thing, people always want to know varieties. This is about 15% Petit Verdot, and I couldn't bring the 10 because it was just bottled yesterday. So this spent 2 years, 24, 25, 26 months in barrels. And interestingly, as we've gone to aging our red wines on their lees as our white wines are, it seems to retard the development, which is why we've gone to 2 years in barrels, but also it seems to just eat up the new oak. So this is 100% new Taranceau, and yet you just don't find it.
Okay, Benoit.
The realm you're tasting is realm, a little bit on realm first quickie, not to be annoying, but Juan Mercado founded realm in 2002. First time we worked with the Dr. Crane in Vineyards was in 2005. The wine is a blend of 96% Cabernet from Dr. Crane, 4% Petit Verdot from Dr. Crane. The wine is aged like 18 months in 100% new oak, fermented in stainless steel vats.
Do you want to tell us where the Dr. Crane Vineyard is?
Oh, the Dr. Crane is...
Technically. Politically, it's
close from the creek. Don't tell me you smell the dust.
All right, I'm going to tell them where it is, because I live right near that vineyard. And you know something? It's right next to the oldest cement factory in the neighborhood. It's next to Harold Smith Cement Factory, and but I think it's just an amazing vineyard, and it is right next to not the high school, but the primary school. Extraordinary vineyard. You miss it almost if you're not looking fast, because it's right next to the little bridge that goes over Sulphur Creek. But it's an extraordinary vineyard. I think it's Aaron called it one of the jewels of the valley, and I would agree. Well, that's why the cement factory is there, right? Yeah. Okay. Who was that? Beth.
I'm sorry. I was tasting the other wine, making notes. Okay, so the Spottswoode wine, as I said, is all from our estate vineyard, which is on the west side of the town of St. Helena. It's the alluvial soils right at the base of the hill. So this wine is about 5% Cabernet Franc. We use about 70% new oak, quite a blend of different oaks, so not one type. And generally, the wine is in barrel for roughly 20 to 22 months. For example, we'll be bottling our 2011 vintage coming up here in July. So we generally bottle in sort of July or August, depending on the vintage. Some we've held longer, like the 06. One time we held longer in barrel. So it's not always a recipe. But again, it's about that 65 to 70% oak range. We want the oak to be, a component of the wine. And so that's where we are on that. And it's all French oak, of course. Is that enough info?
Yeah.
So going back to the issue of the appellation issues, it's interesting how we are using the appellations as I think they should be used, as locators. And I think that they do, when we laid out this master plan of the valley, of basically the townships and the ranges, I think we caught the alluvial fan portion of it, of the valley floor, and graded it separated it, not in precise ways, but in very effective ways relative to the topography. All of the boundaries were initiated by drainages and also boundary lines. There's a practicality in capturing these issues. And I think that I'm pretty proud of how this shows compared to other areas, maybe across the Mayacamas Range, as an example, which has a lot of overlap and a lot of extended areas. So part of the reason to do this ahead of time was to capture the uniqueness and then to understand it later. Understand it, to find it, to figure out what it was about over time. So that's the reason we advocated broader, larger, broader, but distinctive appellations initially. And it discouraged refinements of it until a much, much later time, because I do agree with what Jeff was saying and about the complexity, the incredible complexity. But we felt a need, a compulsion to move, to capture the momentum, to preclude overlap and craziness from happening, which has happened in other areas. So I'm pretty proud of what we were able to accomplish, not as a mandate, but as a template, which has then, over time, been reinforced. So, the wine. So I found growing up at Krug, but also my professional life at Robert Mondavi, I was very Tokelon-centric. I had an opportunity of understanding the valley on a pretty broad basis. When all that shifted in 2004, I became free to think about things in a much broader way. And it was so interesting to discover the incredible variation in this beautiful valley. It is so varied, as we have all said. And what I was looking for was something on the east side facing west. Exposure was important to me. A goal of having something that was fabulous exposure at elevation, small. Our vineyard is on Pritchard Hill. It's the highest vineyard on Pritchard Hill, south-facing slopes, west-facing slopes, 62 acres of vines. We only are using a small portion of that. This is 92% from our estate, not 100% yet. And the varietal mix is 71% Cabernet Sauvignon, 14% Cabernet Franc, 11 Petit Verdot, and 4 Merlot. And as Dave was saying earlier, I think that even though we were raised a la Bordelaise, which means racking and aerating and fining, I think all of us seem to be, or many of us seem to be gravitating towards more Burgundian élevage for our wines. Now,
I'm going to interrupt because I quote you on this a lot.
Oh.
Tim once said, "We've learned to make Pinot Noir from our Chardonnay, and now we're learning to make Cabernet from our Pinot Noir."
Absolutely. Well, no, it's true. You know, the advantage we had at Robert Mondavi, or any of us that produced multiple varieties, you learn to define things by what it is, and very importantly, what it is not. And that gives definition to that in a very articulate, precise way. But I think as our goal is to not replicate, not to go after what they do over there, and not just to follow what the best do. And it speaks to our maturation. It speaks to the maturation of the industry. It speaks to the maturation of us as winemakers, the confidence that we have to identify practices of our own. And we have all been around long enough to understand that and to learn from these various varieties, what we're producing and what we're not producing, but then to have something that we feel optimizes that individual site, as Beth was saying. I think all of us are trying to optimize that individual site. It's fundamental. And then to accentuate that. So for mountain fruit, I think particularly, it's very important. We have long maceration, 35-day maceration, oak fermenters, cement fermenters, no stainless steel. I think stainless steel tends to attenuate the tannin, which you can mitigate in other ways. But oak tends to give complexity and range of personality. The cement gives minerality and interest to the wine. And for the mountain fruit that we have now on Pritchard Hill, 1,300 to 1,600 feet of elevation. We haven't talked that much about fog, but being above the fog line has an enormous impact. We have a moderate temperature zone there. The lows are not as low and not as frequent. Frost, we don't have the frosts as readily in the mountains as they do in the valley floor. They're not as hard. And also, by the same token, at high temperatures are not as high. And so there's a more moderate temperature. And so it has a big impact on the personality of the individual wine. And ultimately, people have asked, are you going to have an appellation at Pritchard Hill? Well, I think that we're great friends with the Chapelets. I can go on about all the intertwining of that, but they do have the trademark Pritchard Hill, and so I don't think it will be that anytime soon. But I do think that the area is a very distinctive one and deserves to be recognized in an interesting way. But I think all of us are focusing on optimizing our own estate. We certainly are, and we're very proud to be where we are. I wouldn't want to be anywhere else in the world than where we are right there and here in Napa Valley.
Okay. The next wine's my wine, Covenant 2010. We use the Napa Valley appellation, but here I'll just stand up because I know I'm kind of behind. But I've made wine out of 3 different vineyards in Calistoga, and this one is the best. It's not far from here, just down at the other end of Larkmead Lane on the west side of the valley. It's very alluvial with a lot of big rocks in the soil, and all one clone 7 Cabernet. It's fermented very simply, native yeast. We don't filter it. I don't fine it. It's all free run, so there's no press wine in there. And it's in barrels for about 18 months, about 50 to 60% new oak, all French. And I don't know, it has a very distinct, this was the 8th vintage that I had worked in this vineyard, and it always had a very distinctive kind of a licorice quality or anise quality that I find in this again. and some nice herbal notes. I think Cabernet without any herbal notes is boring. This has got it, but it's also, I hope, got enough ripeness for you to appreciate as well as Napa Valley Cabernet.
So the 2010 Hourglass Estate Cabernet is the next in the flight. For those of you who know me, you've heard me say this a gazillion times. But again, it goes back to my dad: location, location, location. And so the place really means something, and it means something, especially relative to our earlier discussion about the complexities of trying to draw this line between sense of place and what you taste in the glass, and is there commonality or not within the sub-appellations. And so the Hourglass Estate takes on its name from the fact that Napa Valley is more or less shaped like an hourglass, and this vineyard defines the pinch or the narrow crossing at Lodi Lane. And essentially what it is it's a toe of fractured bedrock that has been pushed out from the base of the Mayacamas mountain range, rolls off, and hits the valley floor. And it's a soil series called Hambrite, and Hambrite is generally found as a mountain soil series, as it's a fractured bedrock that gets pushed upward. In this case, it was pushed out. So it's a mountaintop soil at a valley floor location. Literally starts at the valley floor, and then this little hillside rolls up about 60 feet and then flattens out. In addition to this very unusual combination of a mountaintop soil at valley floor, you also have a thermal dynamic relative to the pinching of the two mountain ranges. So we have a cooling effect that will start at about 3:30, 4 o'clock in the afternoon as the airflow that is moving north-south up the valley will bottleneck at the Hourglass Estate site. And that has a very profound impact on the ripening cycle there. It typically will hold our sugars in check a little bit later into the seasons, keep our acids a little bit higher and our pH a little bit lower, as we're waiting for the tail end of the phenolic ripeness and seed ripeness and tannin ripeness and anthocyanins and all those complex things that kind of constitutes what winemakers talk about as phenolic ripeness. And so the geography of this vineyard is really fantastic in terms of balancing these different, very complex web of chemical relationships. And so it's a 100% Cabernet, which is a small 4-acre hillside vineyard. So we do 500 to 700 cases of this wine a year, and that's the little deal for Hourglass. So again, thanks for coming.
I would love to geek out about these wines for about an hour with you, because tasting through them, they're all phenomenal, and they're all from very special places. For me, in the Napa Valley, some of the most amazing sites in the Napa Valley are represented here, and I'm very impressed by this group of wines. I want to talk about one in particular that's was a big influence on the wine that you're tasting from me now, and that's Spottswoode. I've always been fascinated by Spottswoode. I think it's the Mozart of Napa Valley wines. It's a beautiful, subtle, elegant, wonderful wine, and I think it has a lot to say about St. Helena more than anything else, and about its certain site in St. Helena. And that fascination with Spottswoode and the sort of fantasy that they would one day give it to me and I could take off the S and call it Pottswood. Is that all? That really drove me to make this wine. I think the combination of gravel soils and Cabernet Franc is not a unique one. It's been a magic combination for many years, and I've always been really fascinated by the benchland in St. Helena. And I think there's been a lot of talk about Rutherford and Oakville being these great benchland sites, but there's been very little talk about St. Helena. And I think the reason that is the reason I call this wine La Carte et le Territoire. The name comes from a book by Michel Houellebecq who's a French author. He talks a great deal about aging and who we are and how we figure out who we are in this book. And so I dedicated it to him. But I think that the idea of la carte et le territoire, the map and the territory, is in St. Helena. When you look at a geological map, there's all sorts of fascinating sites where you could grow grapes. And then oftentimes when you go out to look at those sites, the real territory, there's a giant house there. And because of the real estate prices in St. Helena, it's become very difficult to grow grapes in St. Helena, and I think that's kind of a sad thing. I recently saw a perfect example of this, not next door to Spottswoode. There was a guy that bought a house, and he decided he needed a swimming pool in the garage, so he took out about a half acre of vineyard land that was unique in the world and put a swimming pool and a garage mahal there. And I felt like going and knocking on this guy's door and saying, you know, if you wanted to go swimming, you could have joined Meadowood, and if you wanted to park your car, you could have parked it on the street, because this is some of the most unique vineyard land in the world. And I think that was the influence that was behind this Cabernet Franc.
Well, one thing that kept coming out over and over again, it seemed to me, was everyone talking about individual vineyard sites and the Napa Valley, and the AVAs in between seem not to mean very much to any of you up there, more than a political boundary. I mean, did I misunderstand that? Or are you all... Okay, so does anybody... Then the idea is more like the village concept that Aaron talked about in Burgundy, and then dividing individual sites into Premier and Grand Cru sites. Do you want to hazard any remarks about what you think are some of the Grand Cru sites in St. Helena? Anybody want to do that?
I would say that the appellation system are relevant, and what I would argue is that we have captured them effectively. They are not drawn to political boundaries. They do define differences. It's easy to say that Calistoga is different from Carneros. Would you grant that? Okay. And then yes, and then would you say then that perhaps Rutherford is different from Carneros? Okay, so I think if you continue this logic, then you do capture the differences that are there. I think it's very clear that there are differences of climate. There's differences of rainfall. There's differences of soil makeup, and the differences are very distinctive at the extremes. But then, how do you capture those extremes in a way that protects the integrity of the logic of the valley, of the parent material of the mountains, the alluvial material of the valley, going cross over and up again to the mountains? There are big differences between the parent material and the valley floor, and then there's differences of rainfall going up and down the valley, and Carneros has a very different soil type than Yountville, and Yountville from Calistoga. So if you just extend this, then you can say that we have captured this effectively. We will learn what those nuances are over time, but we've captured the capability of doing so with this system. I don't think that, so it is a blend, but after all, wine is a function of sight, it's a function of the vintage, and it's a function of the people that interpret it. So over time, it takes a long time, I think, to see that, but it has happened in Bordeaux. They have a system that allows it to be captured. They have a system in Burgundy that allows it that has captured it, perhaps. But I would argue against rushing in and defining the appellations of vineyard to make Spottswoode or the Crane Vineyard, this is what it is. I would say that ought to have flexibility for the individual people that are there, and also the passage of time to understand what these differences are. And lastly, I would be absolutely adamantly opposed to any requirement that would say this should be Cabernet Sauvignon, or this should be Pinot Noir, or this should be this way. Could you imagine, and Beth reminded me of this, if we were to do an appellation, Nate Fay and I were to get together back in the early 70s and say, let's develop Stag's Leap. Warren is still at Robert Mondavi Winery. Nate, what do you think? Well, I think that what we have to do is to go to UC Davis and figure out what the right things are. Well, of course, granted, we have this authority. Then, well, okay, done. We will have 8x12 planting on AXR1 rootstock, and Napa Gamay and French Colombard will be what we have for Stag's Leap District. Isn't that the way it ought to be? And so I think that does make it more precise, because it's just a variety, perhaps. Some would argue in favor of that. But it precludes the evolution. It precludes the knowledge. It precludes the experience. That is why I think Californian wines are on the stage that they are today and have not been held back as a system that would be so precise so as to impede advancement. I think that would be very, very unwise for us to adopt just because it has been adopted in other areas, and some would argue successfully or not. But I think that the flexibility that we have in our appellation system is, in fact, I believe, a great strength, and it is a locator for the consumer. We have to remember that this is not just for us, but ultimately it's for the consumers to be able to say, oh, this is Spottswoode, it's St. Helena. Well, look, without St. Helena, where is it? Well, it does provide a locating it's a system of address that goes from the broad to the precise. I would just argue that we keep it broader for a while.
I'll play the devil's advocate a little bit. Carneros is a perfect example of the idea that there should be clima in Napa Valley, because as Michael Havens so eloquently put, there's alto carneros and there is bajo carneros. And if you are on the upper side of the Carneros Highway, there are often soils that have a gravel overlay that produce much better wines than those soils that are pure hair clay loam. Totally different wines from those soils. You look at a property like Hudson Vineyard, for example. Hudson Vineyard's about 2,000 acres. I think 115 of those acres are planted to grapes. One side of the property you can get beautiful Chardonnays. The other side of the property, and I know because they go into the Blackbird wines, ripen Cabernet. So there's clearly differences right there in that appellation.
Alan, here's the answer, real quick. Your readers want something simple. That's the problem with all of our readers, okay? They want a simple answer, but I think, and Dave, in a sense, Dave Ramey said, well, they're in broad brushstrokes, where does the Cabernet get ripe? Where does the Chardonnay get ripe? And where does the Pinot Noir get ripe? So you got broad brushstrokes for those who want a quick and simple answer, but the reality for all of us who make the wine is that it's a lot more complicated, as everybody pointed out.
In Pomerol, the appellation Pomerol includes Petrus on the button, the clay button, and then it goes all the way to Chateau des Salles, Chateau of the Sands. It's completely different. So this, the fact that we have these differences within an appellation, that's fine.
And it may be amplified by the fact that the complexities here are pretty extreme from a soil standpoint, a climate standpoint, an exposure standpoint, and so forth. So it makes our job a little bit more challenging to be able to understand exactly what that means. The other thing is, and we haven't really talked about this, but the time element. I mean, we've only really been peeling back the layers on this for a very short period of time, 40 to 50 years, which is not much. I mean, continental Europeans have had significantly longer periods of time to figure out what this complex thing is all about. So it'll be, somebody said, maybe Benoit, I think, said, It'll be a lot of study for the next 40, 50, 100 years, however long it takes to really define this. And so there are multiple answers to that question, unfortunately.
A question about one of the themes that seems to run through a lot of the comments on the panel today is a celebration of diversity of soil types, diversity of climates in Napa Valley, which I agree is fascinating from a consumer standpoint. But I wonder how that squares with almost the rush to monoculture on the variety end. And I agree with what Jeff and Tim said. We're within a generation or two of understanding what these soils, what these climates allow us to do. Does the economic pressure of what one variety can demand on the market impose its own set of regulations or choices for winemakers and vineyard owners in terms of what to plant?
I just want to answer quickly. Yes.
and is that a good thing in our point in time being a young wine-producing country?
I always say not always, because for an estate, for example, we are like our 12 vineyards, we are producing 100% Cabernet, and we started to plant some Merlot, some Cab Franc, and diversify. So it's not always the case. I mean, for the growers' standpoint of view, yes, you make more money on a Cabernet than a Petite Syrah. So yes and no. But also, you will not plant Cabernet Sauvignon where it doesn't ripen and where you cannot sell it. So you're going to have to go with what's work and what you think give a better product and a better satisfaction to yourself and to the consumer at the end, I think.
Would the panelists here potentially agree or disagree that that each individual site has ultimately a match with one or several varietals, but there are many varietals that would not work on that site, and so by the characteristics of best use, then, for example, Hourglass was originally planted to Zinfandel. When we replanted it in the early 90s, we were hit with phylloxera. We had to pull it out. We had Dr. Cleaver come down and work with us to try to figure out what the best use was. And the answer to that question was, you know that you can grow great Zinfandel here, but the ultimate best use of this property is probably Cabernet. And that's a function of economics as well as terroir. So, again, kind of a complicated answer for your question, but I do think that economics play into it. And I also think that the site specificity of what's going on with soils, what's going on with climate, with aspect, and all of the little microclimate issues, also, all of that plays together. Tim, did you want
I would also say personal preference has always got to play a part of this too, because you can have someone that says, I could care less whether I am in the Côte de Beaune, it should be Chardonnay. I'm planting a red, or just the opposite. And you're seeing that starting to happen in Burgundy, where people are choosing to do different things based on that small area being suited, or that small area being to the preference of the owner, and it all plays.
If you plant the varietals to the right terroir, economic success will follow. That's right. Yeah, exactly.
We have time for one more question, and then we're going to adjourn to the premier lots. Glenn?
Well, coming to a tasting like this, once again, reminds me how much I love being in the wine business, as well as being alive. Thank you for that. This is an amazing grouping of wines. And as we get ready to embark on the 11 vintage, and a rainy year, difficult, what I'm wondering is our technology and experience, or how much has the technology experience that we've garnered in general, in particular over the last maybe 5 years, made vintage dependence less of an issue? And particularly in regards maybe to this 11 vintage as we get ready to embark on Premier.
I would say that economics has made the biggest change, because back in the 60s, when there's a fourfold difference between the least expensive wine in the world and the most expensive wine in the world, you couldn't do a whole lot in the vineyard. But today, the economics are enormously broader, and so as a result, you can put more investment in the vineyard, you can support smaller crops, You can micromanage the vines, which is ultimately what is going to then allow you to do well in a variety of seasons, and that precise viticulture. It used to be that we would touch the vine twice, at pruning and harvest. All the rest of it was much more distant. Today we touch the vine so many times that wasn't possible back in the 60s. It just wasn't possible, and it wasn't done because there was not that economic capability to realize a higher level.
I was just going to say we'll never ameliorate vintage, and we don't want to. I mean, to me, what the defining characteristic of a great estate or a great property is if you can make great wines from it on a less highly regarded vintage, however you want to word that. Or I shouldn't say highly regarded because theoretically the 11 hasn't been judged yet. So that's unfair, and I jumped ahead. We're really excited about our 11. Is it going to be different than our 10? Yes. Is it going to be different than our 9? Yes. And that's a good thing because now you're speaking to site and you're speaking really to vintage, and there should be vintage variation. So we're really excited about our 11. And for example, if you want to look at two vintages that might have been similar, say 97 that was this highly regarded vintage, then poor 98 came on its heels, and I think it was Jim Laube who called it the black sheep vintage as a quote. And really when you taste those wines now, at least for Spottswoode, our 98, although it does show kind of uncharacteristic green olive characters, which is not normal, quote, for Spottswoode, that wine is holding up and is so much more interesting right now. The 97, for us, and I'm just being really honest, it was a bigger vintage, and it's really pretty right now, but I don't think it has the staying power that the 98 has. So the really nice thing is when you can have these vintage variations, and then you can say, see, from this piece of ground, this is what we can do in a vintage that, 11, no matter what you say, was more challenging because it was just cooler. But it's going to be really interesting to see what a cooler vintage meant or means here, and it's going to be really educational. And the wines, I think everybody here, I'm assuming everybody here is going to be making their 2011, and we're going to be proud of it for what it is showing that particular vintage. We're really excited about ours. Is it different, like I said, when you taste it compared to what you're tasting here in the glass with our 09, will it show itself? Will it show that Spottswoode vineyard and honoring that site differently? Yes, it's going to reflect what that vintage gave us. But we love these kinds of vintages.
Well, I'd just say, Glenn, that the 11s have surprised me. I mean, the reds now, the Cabernets that I'm talking, and not just mine, but my consulting clients, they have gained strength in the barrel over the last year. So are they a little lighter? Yes. But are they true? Are they charming? Are they delicious wines? Yes.
All right. I'm going to let's say one more time, thank you to the panelists and to Jeff Smith and his whole team for hosting us today, and of course to Charles Communications and Kimberly Charles and her staff.